It's no surprise Capcom loves Resident Evil 4 about as much as Bethesda loves Skyrim. The game came out in 2005 and 18 years later, you can still play it on the newest game consoles. It's been treated to a fantastic remake as well. You can even play both the original and the remake version on your phone. I'm not sure why you would want to do that, but the option is there, I guess. I wouldn't even be surprised if before long, you'll be able to play it on your fridge display. Which brings up the question, just how many different ports and versions of Resident Evil 4 are there? And how did this Gamecube exclusive end up on almost every single console since its release, except for one? Join me as we take a look at all the different ports of Resident Evil 4, going in order of release date, so we'll get to see how the game evolved over the many different ports, and in some cases how it devolved. So let's take it from the top, shall we?
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Starting off, we have the original, the classic Resident Evil 4 experience on GameCube, the very first release of the game back in 2005. We'll find differences depending on the regional version of the game, the North American version releasing first, being followed shortly after by the Japanese version. These two versions are pretty much identical when played on normal, minus a certain death animation in the game, and a cool Easter egg only available in the Japanese version. When Leon is killed by the chainsaw enemy in the North American version, decapitation occurs, and we can clearly see Leon's head drop to the ground. But this was removed in the Japanese version, which instead just has Leon's face slightly mutilated before he dies. As for the Easter egg, for a small section of the game, you get to control Ashley, solving puzzles and dodging enemies. During this part in the Japanese version, you're greeted by an old friend. Fixed camera angles that fit perfectly here, where there's no hectic gunplay or need for aiming. Makes me wonder what the reason for not including this in other regions would have been. It's even been left out of multiple releases. The European and the Japanese versions also feature an easy mode not present in the NA version. Now this is where the bulk of changes are. Unlike other easy modes, which typically just make the enemies weaker while making the player far stronger, Resident Evil 4 takes things a step further. Aside from starting out with the shotgun, some portions of the game are just outright removed. In Chapter 3-1, in order to enter the castle, you need a key from another building. On easy, this building is locked, allowing you to go straight into the castle. In the following chapter, you're greeted by the iconic hedge maze, one of the most frightening sections of the game, dealing with the enclosed spaces and the fast dog enemies. That's all gone because the gate to the maze is locked, allowing you to completely skip it. Later on, unlocking a door requires two items, a King and Queen's Grail. On easy, the King's Grail is already set in place for you, bypassing the room where you obtain it. A small frantic room where you have to deal with infected suits of armor. In the same chapter, the clock tower that you would normally go inside of is locked. It's honestly just a very strange action to take away experiences from the player just for playing on easy. Do you guys know of any other games that have done something similar with their easy modes? Later that same year, the PlayStation 2 port was released, even though all the copies of the GameCube version came with this little tab on the box art only for Nintendo GameCube. I guess technically that was true for about 10 months. The reason behind this, like most things in a corporate world, is money. In 2001, years before the release of RE4, in an announcement called the Biohazard Strategy Presentation, Shinji Mikami, the father of Resident Evil, revealed to the world that the future of the series would be exclusive to GameCube, and more importantly, that the GameCube would be the only place to play Resident Evil 4. Famously, Mikami stated this: "Make no mistake, Resident Evil 4 is coming out for the GameCube. It will not come out on other game platforms. If it does, I will commit a ritual." So it must have been a massive shock to Mikami when, a year out from the GameCube release, Capcom put out a press release stating that RE4 would also be coming to the PS2. If we take a deeper look, this decision was most likely made due to the GameCube's popularity. Despite being loved nowadays in the far future, initially the GameCube was not that well received. Locking a mainline title of one of your flagship franchises to an underperforming console, not really the greatest idea. Capcom already learned this lesson with Code Veronica, which you can find out more about in this video. So, to maximize profits, enter the PlayStation 2. Unfortunately, the PS2 port looked a bit worse, having all-around decreased graphical fidelity due to a lower polygon count. Many lighting effects were also missing. Ashley's skirt was no longer animated, and almost all of the real-time cutscenes from the GameCube version were converted into pre-rendered cutscenes in order to preserve the quality. These did not age too well. This also means if you were wearing a costume or any accessories, Leon would default to his original costume for that cutscene. Rather than make a lesser port and leave it at that, Capcom made new content specifically for the PlayStation 2 release. That would be featured in every other version afterwards. This included the Separate Ways mini-campaign where you play as Ada, not to be confused with Assignment Ada. Ada's Report, which is a short documentary that unlocks as you progress through Separate Ways. The Movie Browser, which lets you rewatch cutscenes, and the PRL 412 laser gun that unlocks after beating Professional mode. Along with all this, new costumes were included. A set that gives Leon an incredibly smooth-looking pinstripe outfit, and Ashley an invincible suit of armor. A godsend for some people. If you owned RE4 on GameCube, sure, you got the better looking game almost a year earlier, but you miss out on all these extras, which in my eyes makes the PS2 port the better version here, despite looking like this sometimes. At this point, Resident Evil 4 was making the rounds, first an exclusive to GameCube, now a PS2 version, but what about the original Xbox? How come it was left out of the RE4 console monopoly? There's no direct reason, but Microsoft going to talk to Shinji Mikami directly certainly did not help their case. During the meeting, Mikami asked this to Microsoft execs: "What is your philosophy?" Sony says games are entertainment, something larger fueled by the emotion engine. Nintendo says games are toys, created by the legendary Shigeru Miyamoto, perhaps the greatest game developer of all time. What do you feel? With no suitable answer to this question, the meeting soon dissolved, with Mikami dismissive of putting his creation on the Xbox, although the console would later receive other Capcom games like Dino Crisis 3. 2 years later, in May of 2007, a PC port was released, published in the West by Ubisoft. Apparently, that used to be a thing where Capcom let them publish PC ports because the same thing happened with Devil May Cry 3. But I'm not really sure what Ubisoft actually did because both these PC ports are bad. So for RE4, it's based off the PS2 version, so it includes the extra bonus modes as well, but that also meant using those ugly pre-rendered cutscenes. The ugliness also extends to the game itself. Upon release, the game lacked any lighting at all, almost like something out of alpha or beta footage. It was also extremely buggy, making it a hassle to be able to play properly. You couldn't even use the mouse to aim without needing a third-party trainer. A lot of this was fixed in patches later on, but just the state that the game was released in was appalling. The one upside of being on PC though finally meant mods. 2 months later in June, the Resident Evil 4 Wii Edition was brought into existence, and as with anything being ported to the Wii at the time, it had motion controls. Other than a couple changes to take the new motion controls into account, the game remains pretty much the same. There are accounts of this version of the game being a fair bit easier, with weapons doing more damage, enemies dying faster, things that would normally apply to an easier difficulty, just applying to the game as a whole. I'm not sure how true this is though, because unfortunately I never got to play the Wii version, but if any of you guys have played it, please let me know. Now, taking the superior visuals of the GameCube version and combining them with the extra modes included in the PS2 version, you get the most definitive version of RE4 at the time, on the Wii of all things. So far, Capcom had been content with porting Resident Evil 4 to major platforms like the PS2 and the Wii, but that wouldn't be enough for them. They wanted you to be able to play RE4 on everything, except the OG Xbox for whatever reason. So without further ado, it's time to talk about the mobile edition. Being a port for your phone, there are so many changes. I'm not going to list them all, but I will mention some of the major ones. The game is extremely short with many areas removed. The Mendez and Del Lago boss fights have been completely cut, along with the Iron Maidens, Novistadors, Comills, and the Armored Garradors. All of the cutscenes have been replaced by slideshows because all of the budget went to the opening and closing cutscenes. Funny enough, the merchant only shows up before you start a mission, just like Resident Evil 5, which was supposed to have its own merchant character, but that got cut. The ASCII section was also removed from the port, and the list goes on. The mobile edition was originally developed for Japanese Nokia N-Gage phones, and here in the West, we also got a slightly improved version for iPhones. Upon release, you wouldn't be able to complete the full game, not until a patch came out later, adding paid DLC. Yeah, not a very good look, releasing an unfinished game and then charging players money in order to actually finish the game properly. Now, despite this being a mobile version, it was also developed for a console, one that I've never heard of until researching for this video. The Brazilian Zeebo console, which has probably the rarest port of Resident Evil 4 to exist. A little backstory on this strange console. The Zeebo was released in Brazil and Mexico in 2009, described as bringing the fun and excitement of interactive entertainment and education to those who, until now, have had little or no access to such technology. Which is a strange statement considering that the only way to get games and content for this console was through downloading from the digital storefront. No physical media existed for this thing, meaning without an internet connection, you've got just a shiny paperweight. What's worse is that the console was discontinued only 2 years later in 2011, with the storefront shutting down soon after, making some of those digital games lost media. Now, with Resident Evil 4 for the Zeebo coming in at a whopping 7 megabytes, it's almost exactly the same as the Nokia N-Gage version, with the exception of the enemies being blue for some reason. I'm gonna let a little trailer play for the Zeebo version and you can judge for yourself. Despite being overall the absolute worst way to experience the game, it gives off a certain nostalgic vibe similar to the aesthetic that remakes or a lot of indie horror games go for. It's kind of cool if you ask me. Something about a low polygon count always makes things creepier in my eyes. Here's where the changes between the ports start to slow down. In 2011, Capcom released an HD remastered version of Resident Evil 4 alongside Code Veronica for the PS3 and Xbox 360. A special disc version of the two were released only in Japan called the Biohazard Revival Selection. In Europe and North America, it was released digitally as Resident Evil 4 HD, based on the Wii version minus the motion controls, and included achievements. So finally, a version of RE4 with the improved graphics was available on a non-Nintendo console. Although the separate ways cutscenes still look like this. I remember coming home from school that day and buying both Code Veronica and RE4 on my PS3, ready to lose my entire weekend to those games. Next, in 2014, we have the PC Ultimate HD Edition, actually published by Capcom this time. This was to make up for the horrendous 2007 PC port. Again, being based off of the Wii version, it includes all of the bonus modes as well as allowing you to pick whether or not to play in 30 or 60 FPS. The option to use filters and, well, you know, improved HD textures, the thing in the name. Unfortunately, various issues occurred at launch like slowdowns, constant crashing, and textures not appearing properly, but this has since been patched. So both times on PC release, RE4 was plagued by issues, which is pretty hilarious to me now at this point with how many ports the game has had by now. If you're playing Resident Evil 4 on Steam, this is the version you're playing, along with mod support, This port I'd say is the best version to play if you've got a PC that can run it. Fans have even created a mod project with further improved textures while fixing some things that Capcom didn't bother to touch up. For the 20th anniversary of the series in 2016, we were graced with the PS4 and Xbox One editions, which can also be downloaded on the PS5 and Xbox Series X. Alongside these ports, Capcom also announced Umbrella Corps for the 20th anniversary. Yep, this game was celebrating Resident Evil. I've yet to find a single person that actually likes this, and if you comment down below saying that you do, I'm sorry, but you're lying to yourself. In 2019, RE4 was ported to the Nintendo Switch alongside the Resident Evil 1 remaster, Resident Evil 0, 5, and 6. Now it was possible to play an actual decent version of Resident Evil 4 on the go. And just like all the ports since, all the extras from the Wii version along with HD textures were included. You'd think that would be pretty much it, right? That puts the game on every major console, but oh, we should know better by now. Companies love money, and RE4 is the cash cow that keeps on giving. So in October of 2021, a VR version was released for the Oculus Quest 2, or MetaQuest, I think. I'll be honest, I don't know too much about the VR headsets themselves, I'm too poor for that. But the whole game pretty much got changes here and there to accommodate for the new POV. It's almost like a first-person Wii version. However, gameplay wasn't the only thing to change with this new perspective shift. Certain scenes were either removed or changed, such as the line at the end of the game where Leon asks Hunnigan on a date, another line where Ashley asks Leon for some overtime, and the strangely famous ballistics line where Luis comments on Ashley's chest. This actually sparked quite the outrage at the time, or maybe not so much an outrage as just a vocal minority being extremely vocal, and even claiming the censorship like the scenes were going to be lost media, when most previous versions of RE4 are pretty easily accessible. Initially, this VR version did not come with the mercenary mode that's been included since the original GameCube release, but 6 months later, Mercs was added in a free update, one that went far and above the regular mode. This VR version of Mercs included the classic mode, killing enemies in a row to rack up a chain and get more points, and along with that, you got new modifiers like fog being added to maps, one where you just get to devastate your enemies with an infinite rocket launcher, while another one lets you dual wield broken butterfly revolvers and turn yourself into Revolver Ocelot, just without the ricochets. All these modifiers and modes remain exclusive to this version of the game, and I'm honestly pretty jealous since this is exclusive to the Oculus Quest 2. Now, I shouldn't forget to mention the remake of Resident Evil 4. Not necessarily a port, but definitely worth mentioning here. Although there are way too many changes for me to start listing, lest this video become even longer and just a completely different video. It's also worth noting that this remake version of the game got its own port already. To this, the iPhone. Again, just looking at this layout is giving me conniptions, and honestly, who would even want to experience a glorious game like RE4 Remake like this? No shade if you do, but I certainly wouldn't want to. Without including the remake, Resident Evil 4 has a grand total of 11 different versions since its initial release back in 2005. I know we all joke about Bethesda re-releasing 20 different versions of Skyrim, but Capcom is right up there with them when it comes to Resident Evil 4. It is nice to see that improvements and innovations were added along the way, with some versions even going as far as to completely change how the game is played. Of course, though, other versions were put out too hastily or unfinished, and there is something to say about how willing Capcom was to spread RE4 to every console, well, almost every console, while their other IPs are still stuck on a single console lost to time. Hopefully this changes in the future, but as we've reached the last port of Resident Evil 4, we've also reached the end of this video. I'd love to know what version of RE4 was your first experience, and if you learned anything watching this, feel free to leave a like and subscribe and all that stuff. Thank you so much for watching.